Dating in the modern world can feel like a maze, full of swipes, messages, and the never-ending question of, what are we? But what if your date wasn't even your choice? What if your entire future was decided before you even knew what love was? Number 12. You had zero say in who you marry. Forget scrolling through profiles or exchanging witty banter at a coffee shop. In the Middle Ages, especially if you had land, status, or even just a decent plot of farmland, your parents or guardians often had the final word on who you would marry. It wasn't about your personal feelings or finding someone who got you. It was about business. It was about alliances. It was about securing family legacy or gaining power. Imagine a young noblewoman, perhaps named Eleanor, growing up knowing that her hand in marriage was a valuable asset, a bargaining chip for her father's political ambitions. She might be betrothed as a child, sometimes even before she could walk, to a man she had never met, perhaps from a distant kingdom. Her future husband might be much older, or from a rival family with whom a marriage would secure peace. Historical documents, like marriage contracts from the 12th and 13th centuries, frequently show these arrangements laid out in meticulous detail, often focusing on land transfers, dowries, and political pacts rather than the individuals involved. This was not just a royal or noble problem. Even among prosperous peasant families, marriages could be arranged to consolidate land holdings, ensuring that a family's small farm wouldn't be divided among too many heirs. A father might seek a bride for his son from a neighboring village, not because the son admired her, but because her family owned a well-positioned field that would round out their own property. This meant that the emotional connection, the spark, the butterflies that modern dating chases were completely secondary, if they were considered at all. The very idea of choosing your own partner for love was a radical notion, often confined to the realms of poetry and song, not the practical realities of medieval life. People simply didn't date in the way we understand it today. They were often presented with a future spouse and expected to accept it as their destiny. This fundamental lack of choice was a cornerstone of medieval social structure, making the journey to matrimony an entirely different beast than it is now. Number 11. Money talk was a previous, not an afterthought. Today, you might eventually talk about finances with a serious partner, but it is rarely the first thing you discuss, or the only thing that matters. In medieval, courting money and property were often the very bedrock of the entire arrangement. We are talking about dowries and dower. A dowry was the wealth, goods, or estate that a woman or her family brought to her husband upon marriage. It was essentially her contribution to the marital estate, a way to secure her position in her new family and provide for her if she became a widow. The size and value of a dowry could determine a woman's attractiveness as a bride, sometimes more so than her looks or personality. A wealthy family might be able to marry their daughter into a higher social class if they could offer a substantial dowry, even if she was not particularly well regarded otherwise. For men, accepting a dowry was a way to increase their own wealth and status. It could be land, livestock, precious metals, or even household goods. Imagine the pressure on a young woman's family to gather a respectable dowry, perhaps spending years saving or selling off assets, all to make their daughter eligible for a good match. On the flip side, the dower was the provision made for a wife by her husband or his family, typically a portion of his estate that would be set aside for her use, should she become a widow. This was her financial security after her husband's death. Negotiations for both the dowry and the dower were often long, complex, and handled by lawyers or family elders. They involved intricate legal documents and calculations, sometimes spanning months or even years. These negotiations rarely involved the prospective bride and groom directly. Instead, their families would haggle over the terms as if they were discussing a business merger. Medieval chronicles and legal texts are full of examples of these detailed financial agreements. A young man, say from a minor noble family, might be pushed by his parents to pursue a woman from a wealthier merchant family, not because of any affection, but because her dowry would allow him to expand his lands or fund a military venture. Similarly, a woman's worth could often be literally quantified by the assets she brought to the marriage. This meant that the emotional connection, the spark, the butterflies that modern dating chases were completely secondary, if they were considered at all. This deep focus on financial terms made the path to marriage less about personal connection and more about economic strategy, a stark contrast to the romantic ideals often sought in modern dating. Number 10. Social standing was your destiny. In today's world, while class differences still exist, it is generally accepted, even celebrated, for people from different backgrounds to fall in love and build a life together. Think of a college student from a modest background dating someone from a wealthy family, or a city professional finding love with a country farmer. In the Middle Ages, however, social standing was not just a label. It was a deeply ingrained system that dictated almost every aspect of life, especially who you could and could not marry. Society was largely divided into strict hierarchies: the clergy, those who prayed; the nobility, those who fought and ruled; and the peasantry, those who worked the land. There was very little movement between these groups, and marrying outside your social class was almost unheard of and often strongly discouraged or even forbidden. A noble knight, for example, would almost never marry a peasant girl, no matter how much he might admire her, because such a union would dilute his lineage, disgrace his family, and strip him of his status. His children would not inherit his titles or lands, and he himself might lose face, land, or even support from his peers. The rules were just as strict for women. A noble woman marrying a commoner would be an unthinkable scandal, potentially disowned by her family and losing all her rights and privileges. Even within the nobility, there were subtle but powerful distinctions. A duke's daughter would ideally marry another duke, or at least an earl, but never a mere baron, unless there were extraordinary circumstances like a massive political alliance. For the vast majority of people, your dating pool was literally limited to those born into your same social stratum, often even within your own village or immediate surrounding area. This meant that opportunities to meet people from different backgrounds were incredibly rare, and the social pressure to conform to these rigid boundaries was immense. Historical records, such as court documents and family histories, consistently show marriages occurring within similar social ranks, reinforcing the established order. A young man from a peasant family might dream of a more comfortable life, but marrying a noble woman was simply not an option. His only hope for a better match might be with a peasant girl from a slightly wealthier farming family. This strict social stratification meant that finding a partner was less about personal chemistry and more about maintaining the rigid order of society. It eliminated any chance of romance bridging the gap between different worlds, making the process of finding a match incredibly restricted and predetermined by birthright. Number 9. Religious rules dictated everything. Imagine trying to date when every single action, every thought, every whispered word was under the watchful eye of a powerful religious institution. In the Middle Ages, the Christian Church, primarily the Roman Catholic Church in Western Europe, held immense power and influence over daily life, including personal relationships and marriage. It was not just about praying on Sundays. It was about defining morality, regulating social behavior, and even dictating who could marry whom. One of the biggest complications was the concept of consanguinity and affinity. The Church had very strict rules about marrying relatives, even distant ones. This was known as consanguinity. You couldn't marry your first cousin, your second cousin, or sometimes even your third or fourth cousin. The reasoning was rooted in biblical interpretations and the desire to prevent incest, broadly defined. This presented a huge problem, especially for noble families who often intermarried to keep wealth and power within a limited circle. Finding a suitable partner who wasn't somehow related, especially in areas with limited populations, became a serious challenge. Genealogical records from the period often show petitions for dispensations from the church, special permissions to allow marriages between people who were technically too closely related. This process was complex, expensive, and not always granted. Furthermore, the church also had rules about affinity, meaning you couldn't marry someone related to your former spouse even if they were not blood relatives to you. For example, if your wife died, you couldn't then marry her sister. The church also emphasized chastity before marriage and lifelong fidelity within it. Sexual relations outside of marriage were considered grave sins. This meant that any courting had to be incredibly chaste, often supervised, and certainly without any physical intimacy. Pressure to remain pure was immense, and any deviation could lead to severe social ostracism, penance, or even excommunication. The church also regulated the very ceremony of marriage, declaring it a sacrament and setting strict rules for its validity, including the need for public vows and witnesses. They even held the power to grant annulments, though these were rare and often politically motivated, used by powerful individuals to escape undesirable unions. This meant that the church was not just a spiritual guide but a legal and social authority governing who you could meet, how you could interact, and the very legal status of your relationship, making the path to finding a partner fraught with theological and moral considerations that are largely absent from modern dating. Number 8. Courtly love was a performance, not a reality. You have probably heard about knights, ladies, and grand romantic gestures from the Middle Ages. This was part of something called courtly love. On the surface, it sounds incredibly romantic. A knight dedicating himself to a noble lady, performing brave deeds in her name, writing poems and enduring great suffering for her affection. It was an idealized, often non-sexual form of adoration. It sounds like the ultimate dating experience, full of grand gestures. But here is the catch. It was almost always directed at a married woman, often the wife of a lord or even a king, and it was rarely, if ever, meant to lead to actual marriage or a real-world relationship. Instead, courtly love was a highly stylized performance, a literary convention and a social game played within the upper echelons of society. It flourished in courts, particularly in southern France, during the 12th century, spreading through poetry, songs, and romances. The knight's devotion was meant to ennoble him, to inspire him to greater feats of chivalry and virtue. The lady, in turn, was meant to be an unattainable ideal, her beauty and virtue inspiring the knight's devotion from afar. For a young man or woman in the medieval period trying to navigate relationships, this idealized version of love was incredibly complicated. It set an impossibly high standard for romantic expression, one that had little to do with the practical realities of marriage and partnership. A knight might publicly declare his undying love for his lord's wife, composing intricate poems about her beauty and serving her with unwavering loyalty. This was seen as a mark of refinement and sophistication, not a prelude to an affair or a challenge to the marriage. The relationship was symbolic, existing largely in the realm of art and poetry. To actually pursue a married woman outside of this symbolic context would be a grave offense, potentially leading to dishonor, banishment, or worse. For a young woman, being the object of courtly love could bring prestige and admiration, but it also meant being a distant, idealized figure, not someone with whom a genuine reciprocal date or relationship could occur. It was a performance, not a pursuit of actual love or partnership. This meant that while ideas of passionate, all-consuming love existed in songs and stories, they were often detached from the reality of marriage and daily life. It added a layer of performative complexity to social interactions between men and women, where genuine connection might be overshadowed by ritualized declarations of impossible devotion. Number 7, there was absolutely no privacy. Imagine trying to go on a date when you are constantly surrounded by your family, servants, or community members. This was the reality for most medieval people, making any private conversations or intimate moments incredibly difficult, if not impossible. Privacy as we understand it today, the ability to retreat into your own space, simply did not exist for the majority of society. Homes, especially for the common people, were often small, 1 or 2 room dwellings shared by the entire family, sometimes even with livestock. There were no separate bedrooms, no quiet corners for a whispered conversation. If you were courting someone, every interaction would likely be observed by siblings, parents, or neighbors. There was no going out alone with a potential partner. Even among the nobility, while houses were larger, privacy was still a foreign concept. Lords and ladies lived in castles teeming with servants, retainers, and guests. Their chambers might be partitioned by screens or curtains, but true solitude was rare. A noblewoman would almost always have a chaperone, often an older female relative or a trusted servant, accompanying her whenever she was in the presence of a man not related to her. These chaperones were not just for propriety. They were there to protect the woman's reputation and ensure that no inappropriate behavior occurred. A young man trying to court a lady would have to do so in public, often at court gatherings, feasts, or during church services, with many eyes watching. Any gifts exchanged, any longing glances, any seemingly private conversations would be open to interpretation and gossip. There was no escaping the watchful gaze of the community, which acted as a powerful enforcer of social norms and morality. A young couple caught alone, even in innocent conversation, could face immediate suspicion and rumors that could damage their reputations and prospects for a respectable marriage. This lack of privacy meant that courtship was a highly public affair, dictated by strict social protocols. There was no room for quiet intimacy, for getting to know someone away from the scrutinizing eyes of society. It demanded that all interactions be formal, observed, and entirely above reproach, adding immense pressure to every single exchange between potential partners. Number 6. Communication was a slow burn. In the age of instant messages, video calls, and social media, we can connect with anyone, anywhere at lightning speed. Need to ask someone out? Send a text. Want to confess your feelings? A quick phone call. In the Middle Ages, none of this existed. Communication was incredibly slow, limited, and often indirect, making the process of getting to know someone, much less courting them, a true test of patience and perseverance. Letters were the primary form of long-distance communication, but they were a luxury, not a given. They were expensive to write, requiring parchment, ink, and the services of a scribe if you were not literate. Sending them was even more complicated, relying on travelers, merchants, or special messengers who might take weeks or even months to deliver a message across even relatively short distances. A letter sent from one noble court to another could be delayed by bad weather, dangerous roads, or political unrest. Imagine waiting months for a reply to a letter you sent, wondering if it even arrived and if the person you were trying to impress still remembered you. For the vast majority of the population, who were illiterate, letters were not even an option. Their communication was purely oral and limited to their immediate communities. If a young man from one village wanted to court a woman from another, his chances of meeting her were restricted to market days, church festivals, or occasional family visits. There was no way to chat or get to know someone from afar. Everything relied on face-to-face interactions, which were rare and often supervised. Even when people were in the same place, direct, Private conversation was often difficult due to the lack of privacy described earlier. Messages might have to be relayed through intermediaries like a trusted servant or a family member, adding layers of interpretation and potential misunderstanding. The art of polite conversation, subtle glances and gestures became paramount, as they were often the only means of conveying interest or affection. This slow and indirect nature of communication meant that courting was a protracted process, demanding significant patience and persistence. It meant that understanding someone deeply required extended periods of proximity, observation, and very deliberate, often indirect exchanges, far removed from the quick and easy communication we rely on today. Number 5, life was short, and marriage was early. Today, many people delay marriage until their late 20s, 30s, or even later, focusing on education, career, or personal growth. Medieval life offered no such luxury. Life expectancy was significantly lower, often hovering around 30 to 40 years due to disease, famine, and conflict. This meant that childhood was short, and adulthood, including marriage, began much earlier than it does now. For many, especially among the peasantry, marriage might occur in their mid to late teens. For noble women, betrothal could happen in childhood, with marriage as young as 12 or 14 years old, though consummation might be delayed until slightly older. For noblemen, marriages typically occurred in their late teens or early 20s, after they had completed their training as knights or established some position. The urgency of early marriage was driven by several factors. For peasant families, children meant more hands for labor, and securing a lineage was crucial given the high infant mortality rates. For the nobility, early marriages secured alliances, produced heirs quickly to ensure the family line continued in a perilous world, and cemented political bonds before potential rivals could intervene. There was immense pressure to marry young, not just from families, but from society itself. An unmarried person in their early 20s might be seen as an anomaly or a problem. There was no concept of a gap year or finding yourself before settling down. Instead, the transition from childhood to marriage was often swift and direct. This meant that young people had very little time to date or explore their feelings, even if they had the chance. Their understanding of love and partnership was often shaped by practical necessity rather than personal experience or romantic exploration. They were expected to transition from childhood to married life with little to no preparation other than the arrangements made by their elders. This drastically compressed timeline meant that courtship, if it happened at all, was a swift and often perfunctory affair, driven by the immediate need for security, heirs, and alliances, rather than the leisurely exploration of personal compatibility that modern dating allows. Number 4. Disease was a constant third wheel. Imagine trying to build a relationship when the threat of serious illness or death is an ever-present shadow, not just for you, but for your potential partner and everyone around you. In the Middle Ages, infectious diseases like the Black Death, smallpox, dysentery, and influenza were rampant, and there was little understanding of how they spread or how to cure them. Modern medicine was centuries away, and basic sanitation was virtually non-existent. This grim reality profoundly impacted courtship and marriage. For starters, it meant that your dating pool could shrink rapidly. People were dying young, leaving spouses widowed and children orphaned. Prospective partner might suddenly be gone due to a fever or a plague. This constant uncertainty meant that any long-term planning for a relationship was inherently fragile. Promising courtship could be cut short by illness, or a young man might be hesitant to commit to a relationship if he knew his own life or his beloved's could be snuffed out at any moment. Furthermore, the very concept of health was different. A person might carry scars from smallpox, suffer from chronic ailments, or have missing teeth, all of which were common and often accepted as part of life. While beauty standards existed, the sheer prevalence of illness meant that physical perfection was often secondary to practical concerns, like fertility and general robustness. For women, their ability to bear healthy children was paramount, and chronic illness could be a serious impediment to marriage prospects. For men, a strong physique indicated their ability to work and protect their family. Records from medieval towns and monasteries often mention outbreaks of various diseases, and chronicles frequently report on the devastating impact of epidemics on populations. This constant threat of illness and death meant that marriage was often seen as a way to secure a lineage and ensure survival in a precarious world rather than a romantic endeavor. The rapid turnover of partners due to early deaths and subsequent remarriages was common, especially for widows and widowers. This grim reality made the very act of seeking a partner a gamble against fate, adding a layer of fragility and practicality to relationships that is vastly different from the expectations of long, healthy lives together that modern dating assumes. Number 3. Political alliances were paramount. For those in the upper echelons of medieval society, from kings and queens to powerful lords and ladies, courting was almost entirely a matter of political strategy. Forget personal chemistry or shared hobbies. Marriage was a tool for forging alliances, securing peace, expanding territories, and consolidating power. A wedding could literally prevent a war or unite two warring factions. Imagine a young princess, perhaps named Isabella, whose entire purpose from birth was to be a pawn in her father's political game. She might be betrothed to a foreign prince, not because he was kind or charming, but because his kingdom provided a strategic buffer against a rival power, or because his family held a valuable port. Her personal feelings were irrelevant. The fate of nations could depend on her yes. These political marriages were meticulously negotiated, sometimes for years, involving ambassadors, legal teams, and detailed treaties. The terms would specify everything from the dowry to the number of knights the groom would bring to the marriage, and what would happen if the union failed to produce an heir. Royal and noble chronicles are filled with accounts of these arranged political marriages, which often involved individuals from different cultures and speaking different languages. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, was married first to Louis VII of France and later to Henry II of England, both marriages driven by immense political and territorial implications rather than romance. Even for less exalted noble families, marriages were used to solidify local power structures, prevent feuds, or gain access to important resources. A landowner might marry his daughter to the son of a neighboring lord to ensure peace along their borders, or to combine their military strength. This meant that the individuals involved often had no choice in their partners, and their personal happiness was a distant second to the needs of the state or the family dynasty. The success of such a union was measured not by love, but by its political stability, the production of healthy heirs, and the strength of the alliance it forged. This turned courtship into a highly complex Edaline maneuver, with the daters themselves being mere instruments of larger political forces. It meant that seeking a partner was not about finding a soulmate, but about securing power, land, and stability for one's family or kingdom. Number 2. Legal complexities were a minefield. Modern dating can involve navigating prenups, but medieval marriage had a unique set of legal complexities that made everything incredibly tricky, especially if things went wrong. The church viewed marriage as a sacrament, a sacred and unbreakable bond. Once you were married, getting out was incredibly difficult and truly impossible in the way modern divorce allows. There was no concept of irreconcilable differences. Annulment was the closest thing to a divorce, but it was not a dissolution of a valid marriage. Instead, an annulment declared that the marriage had never been valid in the first place, often due to a technicality like consanguinity, being too closely related. Pre-existing vows to the church, non-consummation, or coercion To get an annulment, you needed powerful connections and a compelling legal argument, often involving long drawn-out proceedings before church courts. This was not an option for the average person. It was primarily used by the wealthy and politically powerful, like kings seeking to dissolve inconvenient marriages to produce legitimate heirs or secure new alliances. For instance, Henry VIII's desire for an annulment from Catherine of Aragon ultimately led to England's break from the Roman Catholic Church, showing the immense power and complexity involved in these legal battles. Beyond annulment, there were complex rules around inheritance. If a man died, his widow's dower rights needed to be protected, and the lineage of any children needed to be clear to avoid property disputes. The legitimacy of children born from a marriage was paramount, as it determined their inheritance rights. Any ambiguity could lead to legal battles that could span generations. Furthermore, the legal age of marriage varied, and laws about consent, though often overlooked in practice, were still part of the legal framework. A girl married off at 12 could theoretically refuse the marriage upon reaching maturity. But such a refusal was almost unheard of due to intense social pressure and economic dependence. This intricate web of church law, secular law, and customary practices made the legal landscape of marriage a perilous journey. There was no simple breaking up. Once a marriage was entered into, it was intended to be permanent, with very few avenues for escape. This meant that the courting phase, if it happened, was less about testing compatibility and more about entering a permanent legal and religious contract with profound lifelong implications that were almost impossible to undo. Number 1. Gender troths were unbreakable chains. In the Middle Ages, your gender wasn't just a biological fact. It was a destiny that came with a strict set of predefined roles, expectations, and limitations that profoundly impacted courtship and marriage. For women, their primary purpose in life was seen as marriage and childbearing. A woman's identity was almost entirely tied to her relationships with men. First as a daughter, then as a wife, and later as a mother. Her value was often judged by her beauty, her dowry, and her ability to produce healthy male heirs. Women were largely confined to the domestic sphere, responsible for running the household, raising children, and managing servants. They had very little legal standing independently of their fathers or husbands. They could not own property, conduct business, or represent themselves in court without a male guardian. This meant that a young woman had very little agency in selecting a partner or shaping her own life. Her future was largely determined by the men in her family. Any courting she experienced would be passive. She was the one being sought, often with her consent being a mere formality. For men, the expectations were equally rigid, though they came with more power. A man's role was to be a provider, a protector, and a patriarch. He was expected to be strong, courageous, and capable of managing land or a trade. His identity was tied to his lineage, his military prowess, or his skill as a craftsman. While men had more freedom in choosing a spouse than women, they were still heavily influenced by family expectations regarding property, alliances, and social status. The chivalric code, while romanticized, also imposed strict behavioral rules, particularly on knights, regarding their interactions with women, often demanding deference and protection. This rigid division of labor and power meant that any interaction between men and women in the context of courtship was heavily prescribed by these gender roles. There was no room for dating in the modern sense of exploring shared interests or egalitarian partnerships. Instead, it was about fulfilling societal expectations, maintaining social order, and ensuring the continuation of families along traditional lines. These unbreakable gender roles meant that the path to marriage was not about individual compatibility or romantic attraction, but about fulfilling predetermined societal functions that had little to do with personal choice.